So I will, without further ado, hand over to Reverend John Bradbury. Thank you, John.
Thank you very much, Lindsay, and good evening, everyone. It's very good to be with you again. It's a little bit hard to believe it's 3 years since we had the first of these gatherings, and I spoke with you at that point. But Steve assures me that that is the case. So nonetheless, it's very good to be back with you. I want to begin with some words from Nehemiah. Then the high priest Eliashib set to work with his fellow priests and rebuilt the sheep gate. They consecrated it and set up its doors. They consecrated it as far as the Tower of the 100 and as far as the Tower of Hanael. And the men of Jericho built next to him. And next to them Zakur, son of Imri, built. The sons of Hassanah built the fish gate. They laid its beams and set up its doors, its bolts and its bars. Next to them Meremoth, son of Uriah, son of Hakoz, made repairs. Next to them Meshullam, son of Berechiah, son of Meshilabel, made repairs. Next to them Zadok, son of Baana, made repairs. Next to them the Tekonites made repairs. But their nobles would not put their shoulders to the work of the Lord. And so this passage goes on for a whole lengthy verse as we hear about each of the families or households or tribes or groups of people who become involved in the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem as the exiles return. And we find this extraordinary litany, we find in it an amazing image of what it's possible for communities together to do. And there is one bit of me that therefore warms hugely to this vision of everyone pulling together, taking their responsibility for part of the collective building project. And then there is another bit of me, perhaps the slightly more cynical bit of me, that goes, yes, but they were not dealing with health and safety and building regulations and managing the associated risks of liabilities of what might happen if someone fell off one of these walls. Those of you who've been involved in running building projects will know only too well what time, effort, and energy it takes to manage risks, to ensure contracts are watertight, that sites are set up in a compliant fashion, and so on and so forth. There are moments perhaps we think maybe it would be easier if we all got out our spades and our shovels and took a bit of wall each and saw how we got along. But that is not the world in which we live now. The world is one where we desperately need community and collective endeavour to build and construct community, for it does not just happen. And we need the buildings which can facilitate community. But we also need to work with the recognition that never mind doing the work ourselves, even setting up and facilitating that kind of building work can at times be beyond many of our congregations. I really was staggered when Steve said it was 3 years since I was with you, and as I looked back, I can see that in some senses, when I read through what I said at that point, not much has changed at all. In other ways, perhaps we have travelled further than we might think as the United Reformed Church. Then we really were still in the back end of the pandemic. I think now, 3 years on, perhaps we genuinely are finally beginning to emerge into what might be the new normal. But I've said that before on many occasions, so we will see. Some of what I said then, I think, is still very much the case. Buildings can be key and central to our mission. And there is also something of a reality that we probably do still have far too many of them, more than we can realistically, even with the whole family of the URC pulling together, keep on top of. What equally does not change is the reality is that we are the kind of church that does not find it easy or even sometimes possible or desirable to strategically decide where we want to be and where not and act on it. But I think this evening I want to make three primary observations. The first is hopeful. The second, a reality check, perhaps infused with a little hope too. And third, to point to some of that road that we have travelled and where possibly it might take us next. At which point you'll hear a little bit more from Miles, who, as the programme manager for the Church Life Review, is much more involved in the nuts and bolts of the next part and phase of the work, which I think you'll be interested to hear something of. So firstly, the hopeful. The annual church return statistics for last year are beginning to be compiled. They are at the moment in draft. They're not finalised, and we all know that what can happen to statistics as you finalise them. However, it shows that the road out of the pandemic is still being travelled in a very positive direction, and I would actually go beyond that and say that they show some initial signs of green shoots beyond simply a return to where we were in 2019. Our membership is still in decline, yes, though the first indications are a little slower than perhaps has been the case. The number of people in worship across the United Reformed Church, even considering the number of individual congregations that have closed in the last year, is up. Recognising also there is a decline in those attending worship digitally. The number of children and young people engaging with our congregations is very significantly up after a catastrophic decline during the pandemic. Some of the hardest to reach people in that time were perhaps children and young people. And the number of people we might call adherents are up as well, slightly. New people emerging into the life of our congregations. And this fits with anecdotal evidence I keep hearing as well. I've heard a number of people say, in the last 6 months, things have changed a bit. Feels like we might have turned a corner after the pandemic. We've had a few new people turning up in church recently. I keep hearing that, and others I engage with who go out about the URC keep hearing that. It's clearly not universal, it's not everywhere, but there is a sense that in many places there are signs of some green shoots. And it's always nice when one's anecdotal evidence begins to fit what you read in the statistics. So there is maybe a sense that we are genuinely emerging out of the other side of the pandemic, and also that beyond that there are indeed sparks of growing life within our congregations. And this is wonderful. We give thanks to God for it. And we do also, at a fast rate of knots, keep giving thanks to God for the faithfulness of congregations over the years whose life has come to an end. There are still a significant number of churches closing each year, and to be honest, I think that will increase before it decreases. Many congregations are approaching the end of their mission in the places they've served, but by no means all. So there are signs of life, hope, and indeed in some places growth. And I say this knowing full well the danger of not yet finalised statistics. So the note of realism, which is perhaps also infused with a little hope, I want to point us to the Theos report, which was the result of some very careful listening to a selected range of congregations that hopefully in some ways were representative. And there is much hope here too. It reminds us that small congregations, and a huge proportion of our congregations are small, many having always been small, but making an extraordinary difference in the communities they serve, witnessing to the saving and transforming love of God. And yet, what the Theos report also points to, which I suspect many of us know, is that many of our congregations are tired, very tired. Not least coming on the back of the pandemic, And people feel the weight of the kind of compliance burden that congregations now face when they try to do anything, never mind a complex building project. Many ministers, elders, and church members feel frequently dragged away from their primary vocation to worship, witness, service, and evangelism by the seemingly never ending weight of burdens upon them, not least, perhaps, the buildings that we are seeking to maintain. I take another note of caution from the fact that across the URC there are a variety of funds that people can apply to. The forensic accounting exercise of the Church Life Review showed just how generous synod funds are with financial support for buildings, and there are various funds at assembly level as well. Buildings funds, mission funds, discipleship development grants, and so on. And yet I hear time and again that money is there to be applied for and made use of, and yet applications don't come. And I wonder what's going on there. It may still be the delayed effect of the pandemic to some extent. We've been in survival mode, I suspect, not development, research, and investing kind of mode. But I also sense that our tiredness potentially breeds a kind of poverty of imagination. Are we in many places too tired to dream dreams, to catch visions, to listen to the new thing that the Holy Spirit is calling us to and already doing in our midst? For our buildings only serve our hopes, dreams, and visions. Our buildings serve our vocation as the people of God. They don't replace that vocation. And that's before one gets close to the kind of energy needed to plan, manage, and actually execute large building projects. What, I wonder, might release us from some of the burdens that we carry to give us the mental, emotional, and spiritual space to dream dreams and catch visions. Which, I think, brings me to the question of where next. Clearly, the big thing which has unfolded since 3 years ago when I spoke to this gathering is the Church Life Review. We have a sense from the Theos report of our charism for community engagement, which is wonderful to have someone else see in ourselves. It's not just us talking about who we are, but others observing that in us. Though we also hear the challenge from that report to link that kind of community engagement with discipleship and evangelism. And we also heard there in that report, as we have heard time and again in so many different forums, the deep need local churches have for more support with a lot of the practical side of church life, some of which, of course, absolutely revolves around buildings. We also saw that we are not a church without financial resource. As churches close, we find ourselves in the odd position of being short on people, but with more financial resources than we've had before. So the question becomes, how do we decide to change gear from accruing financial resources to beginning to spend them down somewhat, along with engaging that financial resource more collectively and less in individual pots to enable us to do the kinds of things that might well free congregations from burdens that take everyone away from their core ministry as ministers, elders, and members? What will give us the spiritual and imaginative space to dream some dreams and catch some visions for our local congregations and the communities they serve? And this is precisely the direction of travel that the General Assembly set us off in last summer. We adopted, for our further work on resource sharing and support services for local churches and exploring possibilities of how we found new communities of worship, we adopted some values and principles, and I think they're worth sharing. We said that the values we aspire to are, as the United Reformed Church, we value conciliar decision-making where we listen to each other and the urgings of the Holy Spirit, where we act with humility, act with grace and generosity, seek to consider the good of all God's people, fostering obedience to the gospel and furthering justice and climate care rather than narrow self-interest. We believe that transparency about our decision-making helps us be accountable to each other and to God, whose mission we seek to serve. We will use the charitable funds at our disposal lawfully and ensure the activities carried out with them is compliant. We will seek to use our resources effectively. We look to be efficient as part of our commitment to good stewardship. We will take considered risks for the kingdom. We prioritise partnership within and beyond the United Reformed Church, and we value local diversity within the family of the United Reformed Church rather than constraining uniformity. Miles will indeed tell you a little bit more about what's going on shortly, but I wonder, as I draw to a conclusion, what the church might look like if we really are willing to live into this way of being together. How might we release congregations from some of the administrative and compliant burdens upon them to dream dreams and catch visions? How might we find the possibilities, the finances, the structures to employ lay people, to serve churches, to boost the capacity that perhaps at times we lack? How might we renew some of our buildings precisely for worship, witness, service, and evangelism? Or what new worshipping communities might we enable to emerge in places that have perhaps little or no church presence, that perhaps have little or no community public space presence either? If we pool our resources and are willing to take some financial risks and spend down some of our rainy day money, all sorts of things might be possible. My prayer is that the Church Life Review might ultimately help us to begin to live life differently together. Read for creativity in the life of God's Spirit, with the knowledge that there can be some financial resource to follow and back up those dreams. For all kinds of reasons, by and large, in this part of the world and at this stage in history, we genuinely are unlikely to come out in our family and community groups and physically rebuild our church buildings. Though who knows, stranger things have happened. But it is possible, if we can find our ways to share our resources together, to take decisions together about what we're going to prioritise, to determine that we will invest some of them in the future, that we might be able to liberate ourselves from some of the stuff which grinds us down, that we might be able to free our imaginations to catch a glimpse of where the Spirit is moving, and we might be able to tend the green shoots that we do indeed find emerging around us in the life of the church, and plant some new gardens that might feed and delight those who come after us. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, John. We're on our way. We'd like to give you an opportunity to sort of to comment, to think about some of the things that John said in his conversation, and I know it can take a little while to sort of for things to sink in.
So we have one from Steve Faber, saying, can we have a pathway or timetable to the November 2025 special General Assembly, if people know about this? What are the steps along the way?
We can certainly have that. I think that is a bit of what Miles will give us a little bit further into the webinar. Yep.
Excellent, thank you. We'll wait for that one then.
I think David Thompson had his hand up, I think.
One member in our group talked about a church in his group which now does not meet on a Sunday but on a Thursday with an afternoon and an evening service, and we wondered how much growth in that kind of area. Midweek worship is happening.
That's an interesting question, and offhand, I can't give you the figures for that. We do collect some figures for kind of other engagement with church life through the week, but I simply don't have those to hand. Sorry, I was not thinking in that way. I think anecdotally, we might see that there has in the last decade or so been something of a shift and people engaging with worship and church life at different times and in different ways, be that through children's and youth work with things like the growth of Messy Church, be that through fresh expressions kind of work and worship in church life, and so on and so forth. So I think it's fair to say that we have become certainly in the last generation much less simply of a Sunday church, and a sense in which worshipping life and activity goes on throughout the week.
Thank you,
John. Can you invite Dr. Carol Barrett to ask?
Yeah, yes, I'm sorry about the title. It's left over from another meeting.
That's
I'm
fine.
Carol. I can't change it the way I come through. No, I mean, I'm in Cardiff and Penarth, and there are 5 functioning churches in the pastorate, but one of them nearly died because I think there was something like 5 people attended on a Sunday, but they'd get about 15 people to the coffee on a Thursday. Yeah, and this is in a little small area of Cardiff. So in the end, they stopped meeting on a Sunday, put their service with coffee on a Thursday. Now about 20 people there now come regularly.
Yeah, I think that's a lovely kind of example of what's possible with just a little bit of lateral thinking when people are willing to say, okay, let's engage in worship in the places and times where people are there, rather than expect folk necessarily to come to us. And when you do that, I suspect you often find there's much more openness to engaging with worship than people suspect there might be.
Yeah, I'm going to say this is a slight bee in my bonnet for 2 reasons. One is that, you know, I've only been in URC for 1 year. I've been in the Baptist church locally for 31 years before that. And I would say for 25 years, I've walked to church and seen my community leading with bikes on the back of their cars, or going to do the football run, or going, as I say, to worship in the shopping centre. And because of the change in society that we have, people, unless you culturally go to church, you do not use Sunday mornings to go to church. And I actually think it's the most awful time of the week to actually do church. But also Jesus said, go. He didn't say come at 10:30 on a Sunday morning or 10 on a Sunday morning, or he said go. And in that one sense, this little congregation is gone because it's gone to where the people were willing to gather. It was in their building, but they were willing to gather there. And I think, you know, this is where I often think the church has really gone wrong a bit, because we always say come on a Sunday morning. We got it. To me, we have to get out of that box and we need to go. Where are the people? I mean, for me, with Cardiff, you know, which is the capital city of Wales, there are loads of empty units in some of the, you know, shopping centres. You could set up church in there on a Sunday morning and serve coffee and maybe get people coming in. But that's going to where they are.
I think there might be something of a both and, isn't there? Because the invitation is also really important. And there is something precious about extending the invitation for people to come. And there's something equally vital about precisely doing what you're saying, going. So yeah, I think there's a both and. But your little example there is a great example, I think, because it's graspable, it's manageable. We all know little churches like that, and it does show that with some imagination, something a little bit different can happen. Yeah. So thank you for that.
We had a question from Mark Hayes, saying that, you know, churches are closing. You know, how should we carefully look at the assets that are then available Should we mothball some? What sort of opportunities do you think that might present?
I think that's a really good question. We had a really interesting moment in a recent Synod moderators meeting when I was with moderators, and we had, oh goodness, I forget his name, I'm afraid, but the director of the Church Urban Fund with us, and he was pointing us to one of their resources, which are the sort of look up statistics for urban deprivation and the like for different places. And you know, any postcode in the country, you can get up the data for that area. And there were various folks sitting around the table thinking about churches known to them and looking them up, you know, and realizing that you know, some of our churches that maybe are struggling are in very deprived areas where there is a lack of community resource, where there's a sense that everyone is leaving, and the church closing down is just, you know, part of the succession of everyone leaving. And that maybe there are moments we really need to think about, are there places we just can't afford to leave, which may well be saying, well, this building for the time being, we are just going to keep hold of until we've caught a vision of what might be possible in it. So I do think there's you know, and there are places where I know some of that happens, but I think it is something that we need to be a little bit more alert to. It's really easy to get into the pattern of, oh, another church is closed, we initiate our process, we get the building on the market, we go through the motions, and perhaps sometimes we do just need to stop and think a little bit more. But I say that recognizing that many synods are really stretched, and the actual resources available, human resources available to initiate something new in a place where we might have kept a building, it can be limited. I see Mike Hart has got his hand up. I know there's some really interesting stuff going on in the Northwest about this, right? Where I think you're going to be hearing from Mike at other points, but I wonder whether this is a moment for him to chip in.
Yeah, I don't want to steal my own thunder for next time, John. But just on the Church Urban Fund point, next time we'll be talking about a strategy we agreed as a synod earlier this year called a church with people at the margins, and the lookup tool that John was referring to, which is freely accessible on the CUF website, was an important part of the tools we use to understand the nature and extent of poverty across the Northwestern Synod. There is also a very good tool for congregational self-review with a community focus called Growing Good, and actually on that part of the Church Urban Fund site, there is actually a video, short video of about 6 or 7 minutes, filmed in the Dandelion community in Withenshaw, which is our church in Withenshaw. So it's a really useful source of resource, and actually as a synod we have now become associate members of their Together network.
Thanks, Mike. Very helpful. I'm just going to invite Mark to come back, because that's your previous question. I'm aware that David Thompson, we haven't allowed you to ask your question, and then there's Alison. But Mark, did you want to come back on what John said to your question?
Yes, thanks. I mean, I would like, when we are closing churches, for there to be a sort of part of that process that says, okay, this congregation, you know, has come to the end of its life, which may be slightly premature in some cases, because I think the lack of ministry quite often contributes nowadays to this process. But even, let's accept that's going. But is there another future, which might be this building or a reuse of some assets in this area? And the thing that triggered it for me is south of where I am minister, there is a much larger community with a huge amount of housing development, and the URC has just closed. It's helpful to me because a couple of their members are now coming to the church where I minister, but that really isn't the reason I would like them to be coming. And it has to be outside the URC that the use of that building or that site is triggered if we can't as a denomination support it. But there is no Methodist church in this other community. There is no equivalent of the type of church URC is. The parish church isn't in the centre of the town. and they are now very under-churched. And there are reasons, I think, why the URC has declined, but the opportunity has now gone, I think, to do something in that very large community using a URC asset. And I don't want to be critical because I know how stretched people are. But if we just had that pause to think, is this something we should dispose of, or is it something we can find another use for? I think we would be using the assets, more for the purpose that they have been developed over the years. But thank you for letting me come back on that.
And I just say, and I think we need to join that up because, as you say, it's not just about the asset; it is also about the human, the human resource that's needed. So we need to begin to perhaps think about how we join up places like that with the renewed special category ministry scheme for pioneer ministry in communities that perhaps don't have worshipping communities at the minute. Are there ways in which we can join up different bits of our resource? We're not always very good at doing that because the resources are held in different corners of the URC, but how can we join up the conversations to say, how do we get the human resource into the places where perhaps we do already have the building resource and could be making a difference? There are also, as you'll realise, many complications about charity trust law and what you can do with a disposed building and how you dispose of it and what else it can be used for and so on and so forth. But there are often more possibilities than sometimes we think there are, but it's also sometimes tricky to do some of what you're thinking about. Yeah.
It's Mark and John. Dr. David Thompson, would you like to ask your question, please?
Yes. The question I was originally going to ask related to, in a sense, something similar, but also different. We observed in our group that in 2 or 3 of the areas concerned, the church was finding itself effectively doing work which 20 or 30 years ago would have been funded by local authorities, but no longer is. And sometimes we feel guilty about that. At other times, we feel resentful that the appropriate resources aren't coming from where they should be coming, which of course is a political point. And at other stages, one might wonder how one prioritizes which parts of that provision actually are the appropriate direction to take a particular church community. Now, if you're large enough, as fortunately we are, relatively speaking, you can move in several directions at once, but most churches aren't in that position.
Yes, I mean, I think you put your finger on a dilemma that many churches feel about the kind of activity they engage with. You run a food bank to meet an immediate need, and then you wonder whether in doing so you're, in a sense, letting the politicians off the hook for not providing the basic resource for human survival, never mind human flourishing, I think I might say. And I think we've always got to be careful as a church about how we handle that. How do we do the both and? How do we meet the immediate need and still maintain our prophetic voice? And that's not straightforward. And as you mentioned, funding becomes more and more difficult. I mean, over many generations, things shift between what's publicly funded and what's left to the third sector and what the relationship between the two is. And we always find ourselves to some extent riding those waves as they come and go. But I think it feels like at the end of these years of austerity, well, we hope we might be at the end of these years of austerity, we're often left in a position where the third sector and places like faith communities are being expected not only to provide the kinds of services that perhaps once the state or local authorities did, but fund them as well, because and there are just limits to the range of the possible. But I think the other bit of where you ended is quite important. It's much better for a small local church to do one thing really well make a big difference doing it than try to do 6 things and find that none of them quite touch base because people have spread themselves too thinly. Thank you.
Exactly.
Thank you, John. And then I'm afraid it's not the last question in this session, but there will be other opportunity as well. From Alison, please.
So mine's not really a question. We found ourselves discussing things rather than coming to a question in our group. But I wanted to react to something that John said around churches moving out of deprived areas. And I found myself reflecting on the fact that I'm a CRCW, and CRCWs came out of Faith in the City, which was the Anglican Church, feeling they were doing exactly the same thing, and how often that actually is still happening. And it's where the deprived small churches are that they are needed more. But similarly, the other lady saying about meeting midweek, and the CUF tool is so good to help you understand the context. And the context of not needing to be there at the weekend can be completely the opposite in another place. And so John said something about a bit of both, and that's the point. It's all about you're very close by, if that makes sense. So we always try and make one size fit all, and that's not always the right thing to do. And I think my connection is a bit unstable, so I apologize if you've lost me.
You froze for a moment, but then I think we got you again. Sorry, John.
Yeah, I think we got most of that. And it was interesting when Theos looked at the actual statistics and crunched the numbers. It turns out that, somewhat to my surprise, we are not actually withdrawing at a faster rate from deprived areas than others, or at least in most of the country. And that genuinely did surprise me, because anecdotally, it feels to me rather different. I mean, I started my ministry in inner city Liverpool, and there was essentially a ring of about 6 churches in the inner city area of Liverpool, and I think all but one of them has now closed 20 years later, and that seems not untypical from my experience. I wonder whether it's that poverty is more widespread than we perhaps realise. And anecdotally, we tend to look to urban deprivation, but of course we find deprivation in all kinds of communities, and therefore that maybe hides a little bit of some of what's going on. But I think I would like to think that there is something in our tradition that was deeply committed to being in communities that were often really struggling. You know, in the context of urbanization, we were, as nonconformist traditions, often there first, because the complexities of creating a new Church of England parish were such that, you know, it took a long while for the Church of England at times to be present, and you know, we and the Methodists and the Baptists and others often were the ones who were there. And I would like to think we still have something of a charism to try to be the presence in communities that really need us. And I know that there is a kind of hope, and there's some themes emerging through the decisions Assembly are taking, even if not particularly because they've been strategically determined that way, but our commitment to a new form of special category ministry, our commitment to trying to work in areas of deprivation and around issues of poverty, our commitment to try, if we can release the resources, to initiate some projects that lead to new worshipping communities in new places. They all begin to coalesce and fit together and suggest that, you know, the places we first of all should be looking to do that are precisely those kinds of communities where often everyone else from the pub to the post office has left.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for all your questions and your reflections. We've got them in the chat, where we will we'll be able to record them and include them in our on our webpage, where this video will also go once the webinar has finished. And thank you very much to John as well. Very thought-provoking and as I say, a lovely mixture of hope and realism in there. I'd like to introduce now Miles Dunnett, who is the Church Life Review Project Officer, and he's going to bring us up to date on where the Church Life Review is at the moment and give us some of his thoughts. I'm just looking for him. There he is. Very warm welcome to you, Miles. And the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Lindsay. I'm really delighted to have an opportunity to speak to this forum this evening. So as John said, I'm the program manager for the Church Life Review. So I'm going to be focusing on the more technical side of things, particularly in terms of the process and progress of the Church Life Review and where we've got to. So I've been in this role for just over 2 months now, and things have developed quite substantially since I started. So firstly, a bit of background. Phase 1 concluded after the General Assembly in 2023, and we're now in Phase 2, which is the design phase of the Church Life Review. So broadly speaking, the primary objectives of Phase 2 are to investigate new ways of working in each of the 3 work streams, and I'll come back to them in a minute, to analyse the outcomes of those investigations, and then to deliver a set of recommendations to an extraordinary session of General Assembly in November 2025. So the emphasis really here is on exploration, investigation, and analysis, and that gives scope for creative responses to emergent change. The overall focus of the Church Life Review, as John was saying, remains on this core question of what the URC needs at every level in order for it to flourish into the future. Many of you will be aware that there were originally going to be 3 task groups, and they were conceived on the strength of the resolutions 48, 49, and 51 at General Assembly 2023. Those 3 task groups aligned with the Church Life Review's 3 work streams, which are financial resource sharing, employment of lay workers, and provision of shared support services. So as I say, many of you may be aware that we didn't receive enough nominations and applications to populate those 3 task groups, and that occasioned a revision to the approach of the Church Life Review. So the revised approach I'm about to outline was approved by the Business Committee a little over a month ago. So structurally speaking, the main change is that the 3 task groups will be replaced by a single steering group, and that steering group will be responsible for guiding the content of the Church Life Review. The steering group will be overseen by a Church Life Review subcommittee, the membership of which will be drawn from the Business Committee, and that subcommittee will provide day-to-day governance. We've agreed that any substantive changes to the agreed process will be referred to the Business Committee in its full composition. So we've got processes for changes in place. So our intention is that the steering group will be composed of 8 experienced individuals reflecting the diversity of the URC as far as possible. And those individuals will have an interest in all 3 of the Church Life Review's work streams. And so the work of the steering group will be to inform and guide the Church Life Review, support events and consultations, oversee some of the work led by external consultants, which I'll come on to in a minute, and then to prepare reports and recommendations for GA in November 25. And that will be after the conclusion of all of the investigations and trials. The Church Life Review is a pretty broad project looking at a broad array of things. And so in that, it will be supported by a wider informal consultative network. And that will be composed of interested individuals who'll be drawn into key conversations based on their skills and experience and interest. And that network will itself include a number of individuals who applied to one of the original task groups. So in terms of where we are with populating these various groups and bodies, we now have a full complement of 5 subcommittee members as of yesterday, and 7 confirmed steering group members. So we're just looking for the last one at the moment. So in terms of where we are as a program organization, if you like, we're very nearly up and running. And the intention is to have a process and a methodology which facilitates a conversation and guides decision-making without itself becoming a burden. So the new approach to the structure of the Church Life Review engendered a new approach to the work. And so really part of the reason for the shift is to require less time from volunteers. So the steering group won't be expected to do all of the work themselves. So on the financial resource sharing work stream, much of the work will be carried out by external expert consultants who will undertake feasibility studies on 3 models of resource sharing and report back to the steering group. And I think one of the benefits of going down that route is that consultants will bring professional, financial, and legal expertise in-house, as well as capacity, which the task group would have lacked. But I should say that we are going to take great care to ensure that any consultants engaged by the Church Life Review are fully briefed and completely understand the nuances of the context. And that's very much at the forefront of my mind as I'm having conversations with consultants at the moment. So in the other 2 work streams, which are support services and lay work employment, the steering group is going to collaborate with key stakeholders to devise some new ways of working. And then we're aiming to test some of these ideas through these things called living labs, which we want to design and run in collaboration with synods or in an area of a synod. And I think the living labs, we hope, will enable the Church Life Review to trial some new models on the ground, see how they work for churches, see if they unburden local churches. And they may also be one of the ways in which we can see how God is moving. So coming back to the shared support services workstream, because I think that's going to be of particular interest to this forum, that's closely related to a piece of ongoing work which is currently sitting with the admin and resources team around a compliance resource portal for local churches. And that's obviously linked to some of the previous work that took place on the Plato Handbook. And I think this actually relates to a point that Steve Faber and Rob Weston made in the chat about the growing need for help with compliance work. So this is still a developing piece of work, but it is moving forward, and I'll share a couple of updates now. So an initial questionnaire to local churches is planned and will be rolled out fairly soon. And the purpose of that questionnaire is to ascertain what basic support local churches need with compliance issues in order to unburden them. And then once we've received, collated and analysed responses to that questionnaire, we're going to prepare a set of draft resources. And on the back of that, invite synods to a consultative event to review them, consider them, and then have a bit of a broader conversation about other ways that we can help to unburden local churches and synods too, and you know, how we might be able to think about provision of support services in new ways. So there's no date for that consultation yet, but our current thinking is it will be around October, but we will confirm that in time. But the conversation at that event will obviously inform the work of the shared services work stream. I mean, one of the things that we'll need to think about is what's appropriate for a compliance portal and what needs to be examined, what's a bigger issue that needs to be examined by the Church Life Review potentially through its living labs. But as I say, this is a developing work stream, and the relationship between those work items will develop over time. So another thing to say is that we're really committed that the Church Life Review process is completely transparent and as inclusive as possible. So there are going to be a variety of consultative events throughout phase 2. The upcoming one is going to be taking place now in less than a month, which is causing me a degree of alarm given the amount of work left to do for it. But it's going to take place on the 13th of June, and that is a financial consultation. So synods have been invited to send 3 representatives, members of the steering group, applicants to the original finance task group, and a few other individuals will also be in attendance. And that event has 2 broad aims. Firstly, to discuss and shape a vision for what a new model of resource sharing might look like and enable in line with the values and principles that were agreed in General Assembly 2023. And that's resolution 47 for anyone who wants to go away and look at it on the record of Assembly. And the second objective is to reach common ground on 3 models of resource sharing for the external consultants I mentioned to go away and explore through feasibility studies. And as I've just mentioned, another consultative event is planned around support services, potentially in October. So in terms of the next steps and a very high level timeline, firstly, obviously, the finance consultation in June, and following that, we'll look to move forward with briefing contracting consultants who will undertake some work and feed it back into the steering group. And then we've got inaugural and then ongoing meetings of the steering group and subcommittee. Hopefully they'll take place within the next couple of months, and then ongoing over 2024 and into 2025. From summer onwards, we're going to plan and hope to deliver an initial set of living labs. Again, this is all quite high level at the moment. There are various bits still falling into place. And then over the next few months into early mid-2025, managing a portfolio of ongoing investigations. And then in late spring, early summer 2025, receiving the outcomes of those investigations and analysing them, and then forming them into a set of recommendations for General Assembly, the extraordinary session in 2025 in November. So the final thing I really wanted to say is a small caveat to everything else I've just said, which is that because the Church Life Review is considering complex and interrelated matters, iteration and evolution is going to be necessary. So amongst all this complexity, we are committed to making the Church Life Review a really transparent process. So I'm sure you'll be hearing from me through various fora as time goes on. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Miles. There was a great deal to be encouraged by. I'm a church elder myself, and there's some exciting things in there, but also it's a very clear description and outline of the process. I realise 10 minutes is a very short period of time to try and encapsulate everything that's going on at the moment, but we're very grateful to you for doing that. We don't have a great deal of time, but we would like to put you back into breakout just again for some initial sort of responses to what you've heard from Miles, but also, and we realise that this might be an ambitious ask, but just what sort of support you think churches feel they need at the moment, and how that might tie into what you've heard. And you know, we've all got wish lists, haven't we? But considering the things that Miles has outlined for us, what sort of things do you think might be particularly helpful to you? So it'll be under 10 minutes, I think. It'll be a relatively brief time, but we did want you to give you another opportunity to have a conversation with one another. So please do press the button when it comes up on your screen. Welcome back, everybody. Good to see you back. I appreciate that was a very brief time you had together, but we did want you to have one last opportunity to sort of reflect on what both Miles and John have been saying, and also see if there are any two or three last questions or reflections for either of them before we finish promptly at 9 this evening.
Jim Robertson wanted a question earlier. Would you still like to ask your question? Or not? Don't need to. You're on mute though, Jim, at the moment still.
I think the question moved on in relation to a response to this final session. It was really to do with as to whether we see that part of this worship process is helping people to critically reflect on the society that we have, critically reflect on the inequalities in society, you know, and in a sense from that critical reflection from our theological position, respond to what's happening in society. So in some senses, there's a dilemma there that I don't have a sense from my experience that anything that's comparable with that kind of critical reflection. I don't know whether it's part of the ministerial training. And again, there's a kind of question as to whether there's a role for equipping perhaps lay people to develop this role to work with the congregation. So that's where we came at there. And David Thompson from Cambridge highlighted the dilemmas here of matching up a kind of affluent URC church and a more disadvantaged URC church, and the challenges that would come from this, what I'm calling critical reflection, you know, as part of ministry within the church.
Thanks,
Just
Jim, for that
a very
comment. John,
brief response to that. So in a sense, that kind of critical reflection, that reading the life of the world through the lens of the gospel is a kind of integral part of what the whole church is always called to do. It's, I mean, in a way, it's part of the task of preaching. Certainly part of what our worshipping life should form us as we leave church and go back into the world to do. So it's a vital bit of who we are. There's so many places I could go with what you've just said, but just to sort of say amen, basically, that yeah, this is a vital part of who we need to be.
Thanks, Jim and John. Stephen Newell, your hand up if you'd like to ask your question, please.
Yeah, I think it's difficult to actually ask a question after the presentation. So recently we had at the Southwest Synod Ministers, we had a sort of talk about this from Nicola Furley-Smith, which this is only about a month ago. And what I've just heard today bears little relationship to what Nicola was saying a month ago. And it's like, wow, that's a massive change that you've put in there. And I could say so much about lots of it. I mean, in one sense, I don't want to be negative, but I am really concerned that the response from the local churches is going to be, if you send a really complex questionnaire to the or even quite a simple questionnaire to the local churches, I suggest you might be getting some pretty negative or difficult answers. One of my first roles as in my sort of role in Synod in Bristol area was to host a property roadshow where the wonderful property team from Southwest Synod came down and spoke to the churches. I actually didn't think we'd have any churches left after that meeting. They were absolutely, I mean, I spent the next 2 years calming them down. I'm genuinely concerned that we need to be very careful what we do when we're asking churches to ask questions they don't think they know the answer to, or they don't know why they're being asked. In my group, there wasn't a great deal of, we didn't, we had church secretaries in this little group that we've just had. I don't think they were knowing what to expect. And as I say, I've seen it before. I'm cautious. If you want to make Bristol a living lab, it might blow up, and I'll happily stand with you on that, so that you might learn some lessons. But that is my genuine, heartfelt concern, that we do stuff, we put it onto the local church, and the local church are just mega confused, and then they get quite angry sometimes. Sorry to be negative.
Just if I can respond to that a bit. I mean, there's always a really complicated element to any process like this, isn't there? Because the whole point of a process like this is to try ultimately to offer, in the most straightforward terms possible, the kind of support to local churches that they're crying out for. And we hear that cry regularly. To run the kind of process that can talk about how you finance and structure and in governance terms deliver that kind of support across 1,200 churches, 13 synods, with a cumulative turnover each year of £35 million. By definition, you're talking about structures and processes and models that are way beyond most things that most of us will ever have to engage with in our working lives, or certainly our church lives. I mean, it kind of blows my mind what I've walked into here. So how does one engage a really complex organization like the United Reformed Church as a whole with what's a fairly simple question? How do we much better provide support to our local congregations? And there's a really fine balance between we've got to work with local congregations, because it's no good us plowing ahead presuming we know what they are going to need for help, when actually what we need to do is ask them. A questionnaire is one way of doing it. There are other ways of doing that. In its way, the Theos report was a bit one way of doing that. The actual process of how one thinks structurally about about how you then respond to what you're hearing is going to be very, very complex and a bit mind-blowing. And how we hold all that together and be transparent about what we're doing, but recognize part of what we're doing is going to be very, very complex stuff. And it's about trust law, and it's about governance, and it's about high finance, and it's about all those sorts of things. And at the same time, do it in such a way that does genuinely meet the needs of the local church. It is a really tall order. We need to try not to do what you're fearing. The other thing I think I just want to say about the Living Labs thing is, ideally, we want to use or build on things that are already going on, because there are experiments going on all over the United Reformed Church, where synods are trying new ways of working, new ways of offering support. If we can work with those and alongside those, and hopefully enable the lessons from those learned to be then shared across the whole URC as we think about what we might most effectively roll out more universally, I think we stand a much better chance than if we start from scratch. So I heed your warning, Stephen, and I get it, and I hope you can hear that we're trying to do something that's asking a very simple question, wanting to give a simple answer to it, but having to deal with a mammothly complex structure in the process.
Can I just very briefly add something to that, John? That sort of corollary, to just say, Stephen, that at the moment that questionnaire process is sitting with the admin and resources team who are thinking about some of this stuff, as I said, and obviously I'm conscious that I'm very keen the church life review process does not itself become a burden in attempting to unburden local churches, and that sort of note of caution you've introduced there is always helpful, and so I will pass that on to colleagues, and it's at the forefront of my mind as we explore where to go next.
Thank you ever so much, Roger. I'm really sorry, but our time is up. If I can just encourage you to type it in the chat, that'd be really helpful, and we will address that hopefully in the next session. But just thank you for all the questions that we've received, and any others, as I say, please put in the chat or email them to us later. Over to yourself, Lindsay, please.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you once again to John and to Miles for steering us through some of the issues that the church is dealing with at the moment, and what processes are being worked through. You'll be aware, hopefully, that on June the 4th is part 2 of this particular theme that we're running with the webinars. And it'll be a sort of practical look at some of these issues and looking at Northwest Synod strategy. And we will have with us Mike Hart, who is there. I don't know whether Mike could wave, and some of you may see him if he waves wildly enough. And Becky Winter as well, who's also been with us this evening. She will be with us on June the 4th as well. You should automatically get a link if you're here to the next session. If you don't, please do email us at mission@urc.org.uk. I'll put that in the chat. And it will be advertised again, so hopefully you will see the reminders and the links. Meanwhile, thank you all so very much for engaging in what's been quite stimulating, but also some challenging conversations and discussion this evening. We do appreciate your engagement and being involved and listening and contributing. So thank you very much for giving up your evening this evening. I suggest that we take our mutes off, that we unmute ourselves, and that we raise our voices in a sort of joyful, cacophonous, loud, uncoordinated noise, and share the grace with one another. May the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God,
God,
the fellowship of the Holy Spirit, be with us all and forevermore.
Amen.
A loud and joyful noise. Thank you so much, everybody. And as I
Thank
say,
you.
the recording will be released.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.